This sound file contains the spoken version of a Wikipedia article on Pierre Trudeau, recorded by user Jason Lamarche. The material recorded is current as of the 20th of July, 2010. Pierre Trudeau from Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia, at en.wikipedia.org. Joseph Philippe Pierre Yves Elliott Trudeau, 18th October 1919 to 28th September 2000. Usually known as Pierre Trudeau, or Pierre Elliott Trudeau, was the 15th Prime Minister of Canada from 20th April 1968 to 4th June 1979, and again from 3rd March 1980 to 30th June 1984. Trudeau began his political career campaigning for socialist ideals, but he eventually joined the Liberal Party when he entered federal politics in the 1960s. He was appointed as Lester Pearson's parliamentary secretary, and later became his Minister of Justice. From his base in Montreal, Trudeau took control of the Liberal Party and became a charismatic leader, inspiring Trudeau-mania. From the late 1960s until the mid-1980s, he dominated the Canadian political scene and aroused passionate reactions. Reason before passion was his personal motto. He retired from politics in 1984 and was replaced by John Turner. Admirers praise the force of Trudeau's intellect, and they salute his political acumen in preserving national unity against Quebec separatists, suppressing a violent revolt, and establishing the Charter of Rights and Freedoms within Canada's Constitution. His detractors accuse him of arrogance, economic mismanagement, and unduly favoring the authority of the federal government in relation to the provinces, especially in trying to control the oil wealth of the prairies. Contents. The article contains 21 sections. Section 1, Early Life. Section 2, Education and the Second World War. Section 3, Early Career. Section 4, Law Professor enters politics. Section 5, Justice Minister and Leadership Candidate. Section 6, Prime Minister. Section 6.1, Just Society. Section 6.2, October Crisis. Section 6.3, Bilingualism. Section 6.4, World Affairs. Section 6.5, 1972 election. Section 6.6, 1974 election. Section 6.7, G7. Section 6.8, Republicanism. Section 6.9, Declining popularity. Section 7, Defeat and opposition. Section 8, Return to power. Section 8.1, Quebec referendum. Section 8.2, Patriation of the Constitution. Section 9, Personal. Section 10, Marriage and Children. Section 10.1, Death. Section 11, Spirituality. Section 12, Legacy. Section 12.1, Constitutional Legacy. Section 12.2, Bilingualism. Section 12.3, Cultural Legacy. Section 12.4, Legacy with respect to Western Canada. Section 12.5, Legacy with respect to Quebec. Section 12.6, Intellectual Contributions. Section 13, Supreme Court Appointments. Section 14, Honors. Section 14.1, Honorary Degrees. Section 15, Trudeau in Film. Section 16, Trudeau in Music. Section 17, Works by Trudeau. Section 18, See Also. Section 19, Footnotes. Section 20, Further Reading. Section 20.1, Archival Videos of Trudeau. Section 21, External Links. Section 1, Early Life. Pierre Trudeau was born in Montreal to Charles-Émile Trudeau, a French-Canadian businessman and lawyer, and Grace Elliott, who was of French and Scottish descent. He had an older sister named Suzette, and a younger brother named Charles Jr. He remained close to both siblings for his entire life. The family had become quite wealthy by the time Trudeau was in his teens, as his father sold his prosperous gas station business to Imperial Oil. Trudeau attended the prestigious Collège Jean de Brébeuf, a private French Jesuit school, where he was affiliated with the ideas of Quebec nationalism. Trudeau's father died when Pierre was in his mid-teens, and this hit him and the family very hard. Pierre remained very close to his mother for the rest of her life. According to longtime friend and colleague Marc Lalonde, the contemporary clerically influenced dictatorships of Antonio de Oliveira Salazar in Portugal, Francisco Franco in Spain, and Marshal Philippe Pétain in Vichy, France, were seen as models to many young intellectuals educated at elite Jesuit schools in Quebec. Lalonde asserts that Trudeau's later intellectual development as a, quote, intellectual rebel, anti-establishment fighter on behalf of unions and promoter of religious freedom, end quote, was a product of his experiences once he left Quebec to study in the United States, France, and England, and travel the world. His travel experiences allowed him to break from Jesuit influence and study French philosophers such as Jacques Maritain and Emmanuel Mounier, as well as John Locke and David Hume. Section 2. Education and the Second World War. Trudeau earned a law degree at the Université de Montréal in 1943. During his studies, he was conscripted into the army, like thousands of other Canadian men, as part of the National Resources Mobilization Act. He joined the Canadian Officers Training Corps and served with other conscripts in Canada, as they were not liable for overseas military service until after the conscription crisis of 1944. Trudeau said he was willing to become involved in the Second World War, but he believed that to do so would be to turn his back on a Quebec population he considered to have been betrayed by the Mackenzie King government. Trudeau reflected on his opposition to conscription and his doubts about the war in his 1993 memoirs. Quote, "So there was a war. Tough. If you were a French Canadian in Montreal in the early 1940s, you did not automatically believe this was a just war. We tended to think of this war as a settling of the scores among the superpowers." End quote. In a 1942 Outremont by-election, he campaigned for the anti-conscription candidate Jean Drapeau, later mayor of Montreal, and was eventually expelled from the Officers Training Corps for lack of discipline. The National Archives of Canada, in its biographical sketches of Canadian prime ministers, records how on one occasion during the war, Trudeau and his friends drove their motorcycles wearing Prussian military uniforms, complete with pointed steel helmets. After the war, Trudeau went abroad to continue his studies, first with a master's degree in political economy at Harvard University's Graduate School of Public Administration. Next, he studied in Paris, France, in 1947 at the Institut d'études politiques de Paris, and finally working towards his doctorate at the London School of Economics, although he did not finish his thesis. Trudeau was interested in Marxist ideas in the 1940s, and his Harvard dissertation was on the topic of communism and Christianity. At Harvard, Trudeau found himself profoundly challenged as he discovered that his, quote, legal training was deficient and his knowledge of economics was pathetic, end quote. Thanks to the great intellectual migration away from Europe's fascism, Harvard had become a major intellectual center in which Trudeau profoundly changed. Despite this, Trudeau found himself an outsider, a French Catholic living for the first time outside of Quebec in the predominantly Protestant American Harvard University. This isolation deepened finally into despair and led to his decision to continue his Harvard studies abroad. In 1947, he traveled to Paris to continue his dissertation work. Over a 5-week period, he attended many lectures and became a follower of personalism, after being influenced most notably by Emmanuel Mounier. The Harvard dissertation remained undone when Trudeau entered a doctoral program to study under the renowned socialist economist Harold Lasky in the London School of Economics. This cemented Trudeau's belief that Keynesian economics and social science were essential to the creation of quote-unquote good life in democratic society. Section 3. Early Career. From the late 1940s through the mid-1960s, Trudeau was primarily based in Montreal and was seen by many as an intellectual. In 1949, he was an active supporter of workers in the asbestos strike. In 1956, he edited an important book on the subject, La Grève de l'Amiante, which argued that the strike was a seminal event in Quebec's history, marking the beginning of resistance to the conservative, francophone clerical establishment and anglophone business class that had long ruled the province. Throughout the 1950s, Trudeau was a leading figure in the opposition to the repressive rule of Premier of Quebec, Maurice Duplessis, as the founder and editor of Cité Libre, a dissident journal that helped provide the intellectual basis for the Quiet Revolution. From 1949 to 1951, Trudeau worked briefly in Ottawa in the Privy Council office of the Liberal Prime Minister Louis Saint-Laurent as an economic policy advisor. He wrote in his memoirs that he found this period very useful later on when he entered politics, and that senior civil servant Norman Robertson tried unsuccessfully to persuade him to stay on. His socialist values and his close ties with Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, CCF intellectuals including Frank Scott, Eugene Forsey, Michael Kellaway Oliver, and Charles Taylor led to his support and membership in that federal Social Democratic Party throughout the 1950s. Despite these connections, when Trudeau entered federal politics in the 1960s, he decided to join the Liberal Party rather than the CCF, now the New Democratic Party. This is attributed to a few factors. One, he felt the NDP could not achieve power because of Tommy Douglas's inability to attract Quebec voters. Two, Trudeau expressed doubts about the centralizing policies of Canada's socialists. He favored a more decentralized approach. And three, there were quote-unquote real differences between his approach and the NDP's quote-unquote two nations approach to the Canadian Constitution and the role of Quebec within Canada. In his memoirs, published in 1993, Trudeau wrote that during the 1950s, he wanted to teach at the Université de Montréal, but was blacklisted 3 times from doing so by Maurice Duplessis, then Premier of Quebec. He was offered a position at Queen's University teaching political science by James Corey, who later became Principal of Queen's, but turned it down because he preferred to teach in Quebec. During the 1950s, he was blacklisted by the United States and prevented from entering that country because of a visit to a conference in Moscow, and because he subscribed to a number of leftist publications. Trudeau later appealed the ban, and it was rescinded. Section 4. Law Professor Enters Politics. An associate professor of law at the Université de Montréal from 1961 to 1965, Trudeau's views evolved towards a liberal position in favor of individual rights counter to the state, and made him an opponent of Quebec nationalism. In economic theory, he was influenced by Professors Joseph Schumpeter and John Kenneth Galbraith while he was at Harvard. Trudeau criticized the Liberal Party of Lester Pearson when it supported arming Beaumark missiles in Canada with nuclear warheads. Nevertheless, he was persuaded to join the party in 1965, together with his friends Gerard Pelletier and Jean Marchand. These quote-unquote 3 wise men ran successfully for the Liberals in the 1965 election. Trudeau himself was elected in the safe Liberal riding of Montréal in western Montreal, succeeding House Speaker Alan MacNaughton. He would hold this seat until his retirement from politics in 1984, winning each election with large majorities. Upon arrival in Ottawa, Trudeau was appointed as Prime Minister Lester Pearson's parliamentary secretary, and spent much of the next year traveling the world, representing Canada at international meetings and events, including the United Nations. In 1967, he was appointed to Pearson's cabinet as Minister of Justice. Section 5. Justice Minister and Leadership Candidate. As Minister of Justice, Pierre Trudeau was responsible for introducing the landmark Criminal Law Amendment Act, 1968 to 1969, an omnibus bill whose provisions included, among other things, the decriminalization of homosexual acts between consenting adults, the legalization of contraception, abortion, and lotteries, new gun ownership restrictions, as well as the authorization of breathalyzer tests on suspected drunk drivers. Trudeau famously defended the decriminalization of homosexual acts segment of the bill by telling reporters that, quote, "there's no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation," unquote, adding that, quote, "what's done in private between adults doesn't concern the criminal code," unquote. Trudeau also liberalized divorce laws and clashed with Quebec Premier Daniel Johnson Sr. during constitutional negotiations. At the end of Canada's centennial year, in 1967, Prime Minister Pearson announced his intention to step down, and Trudeau entered the race for Liberal leadership. His energetic campaign attracted the attention of the news media, and mobilized and inspired many youths who saw Trudeau as a symbol of generational change. He was 48. Going into the leadership convention, Trudeau was the front runner and was clearly the favourite candidate with the Canadian public. Many within the Liberal Party still had deep doubts about him, though. Having joined the party only in 1965, he was still considered an outsider. Many saw him as too radical and outspoken a figure. Some of his views, particularly those on divorce, abortion, and homosexuality, were opposed by the substantial conservative wing of the party. Nevertheless, at the April 1968 Liberal Leadership Convention, Trudeau was elected leader of the party on the fourth ballot, with the support of 51% of the delegates, defeating some prominent, long-serving Liberals, including Paul Martin Sr., Robert Winters, and Paul Hellyer. Trudeau was sworn in as Liberal leader and Prime Minister 2 weeks later, on April 20th. Image: Trudeau at the Liberal Convention after winning the leadership. Image: members of Pearson's cabinet, including Trudeau on the far left. Section 6. Prime Minister. Trudeau soon called an election for June 25th. See Canadian Federal Election 1968. His election campaign benefited from an unprecedented wave of personal popularity called Trudeau-mania, a term coined by journalist Lubor J. Zink, which saw Trudeau mobbed by throngs of youth. An iconic moment that influenced the election occurred on its eve, during the annual Saint Jean-Baptiste Day parade in Montreal, when rioting Quebec separatists threw rocks and bottles at the grandstand where Trudeau was seated. Rejecting the pleas of his aides that he take cover, Trudeau stayed in his seat, facing the rioters without any sign of fear. The image of the young politician showing such courage impressed the Canadian people, and he handily won the election the next day. Section 6.1. Just Society. As Prime Minister, Trudeau espoused participatory democracy as a means of making Canada a just society. He defended vigorously the newly implemented universal health care and regional development programs as means of making society more just. He also implemented many procedural reforms to make Parliament and the Liberal caucus meetings run more efficiently, and substantially expanded the size and role of the Prime Minister's office. Section 6.2. October Crisis. During the October Crisis of 1970, the Front de Libération du Québec, FLQ, kidnapped British Trade Consul James Cross at his residence on the 5th of October. 5 days later, Quebec Labour Minister Pierre Laporte was also kidnapped, and was later murdered on October 17th. Trudeau responded by invoking the War Measures Act, which gave the government sweeping powers of arrest and detention without trial. Although this response is still controversial and was opposed as excessive by figures like Tommy Douglas, it was met with only limited objections from the public. Trudeau presented a determined public stance during the crisis, answering the question of how far he would go to stop the terrorists with, quote-unquote, "just watch me." 5 of the FLQ terrorists were flown to Cuba in 1970 as part of a deal in exchange for James Cross's life, but all members were eventually arrested. The 5 flown to Cuba were jailed after they returned to Canada years later. Section 6.3. Bilingualism. Trudeau's first years would be most remembered for the passage of his implementation of official bilingualism. Long a goal of Trudeau, this legislation requires all federal services to be offered in French and English. The measures were very controversial at the time in English Canada, but would be successfully passed and implemented. Section 6.4. World Affairs. Trudeau was the first leader to meet John Lennon and his wife Yoko Ono on their, quote, tour for world peace, unquote. Lenin said, after talking with Trudeau for 50 minutes, that Trudeau was, quote, a beautiful person, unquote, and that, quote, if all politicians were like Pierre Trudeau, there would be world peace, unquote. In foreign affairs, Trudeau kept Canada firmly in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but often pursued an independent path in international relations. He established Canadian diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China before the United States did, and went on an official visit to Beijing. He was known to be a friend of Fidel Castro and Cuba. A mobster said that in 1974 he was hired by New York state mafia members to kill Trudeau, hoping to bait Castro up to a funeral where they would kill him. The plan was apparently later rejected. Image: Trudeau and President of Cuba, Fidel Castro, in 1976. Section 6.5, 1972 election. In the election of 1972, Trudeau's Liberal Party won with a minority government, with the New Democratic Party holding the balance of power. This government would move to the left, including the creation of Petro-Canada. Section 6.6, 1974 election. In May 1974, the House of Commons passed a motion of no confidence in the Trudeau government, defeating its budget bill. Trudeau wrote in his memoirs that he had in fact engineered his own downfall, since he was confident he would win the resulting election. The election of 1974 saw Trudeau and the Liberals re-elected with a majority government with 141 of the 264 seats. In September 1975, Finance Minister John Turner resigned. Trudeau later, in October 1975, instituted wage and price controls, something which he had mocked Progressive Conservative Party leader Robert Stanfield for proposing during the election campaign a year earlier. Section 6.7, G7. Canada joined the G7 group of major economic powers in 1976 after being left out of the first set of meetings. Trudeau wrote in his memoirs that U.S. President Gerald Ford arranged this and expressed sincere appreciation. Section 6.8, Republicanism. Trudeau's outward actions during his premiership led many to believe that he harbored Republican notions. It was even rumored by Paul Martin Sr. that the Queen was worried the Crown, quote, had little meaning for him, unquote. This may have had to do with the erasure of royal symbols, his documented antics around the monarch, such as his sliding down Buckingham Palace banisters, and his famous pirouette behind the Queen, captured on film in 1977. He also glaringly breached protocol in 1978 when he vacationed in Morocco, instead of being in Canada to attend the Queen's arrival and departure. However, he was accused of instant monarchism as well as opportunism during a period of personal unpopularity in the 1970s, when he invited Elizabeth II to attend the Second Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting at Ottawa, 1973. The invitation and acceptance of it started the tradition of Elizabeth attending Commonwealth conferences no matter the location. Also in 1976, after Robert Bourassa, then Premier of Quebec, begged Trudeau to invite the Queen to the Olympics in Montreal, Trudeau, after obliging him, became annoyed when Bourassa later became unsettled about how unpopular the move might be. He commented directly on the monarchy in 1967, when he, by then a cabinet minister, stated, quote, "I wouldn't lift a finger to get rid of the monarchy. I think the monarchy, by and large, has done more good than harm to Canada," unquote. Ultimately, he experimented with the Crown more than any previous politician, and then entrenched the role of the Crown in Canada when he orchestrated the patriation of the Canadian Constitution in 1982. Section 6.9, Declining Popularity. A worsening economy, burgeoning national debt, and growing public antipathy towards Trudeau's perceived arrogance caused his poll numbers to fall rapidly. Trudeau delayed the election as long as he could, but was forced to call one in 1979. Section 7, Defeat and Opposition. In the election of 1979, Trudeau's government was defeated by the Progressive Conservatives, led by Joe Clark, who formed a minority government. Trudeau announced his intention to resign as Liberal Party leader. However, before a leadership convention could be held, Clark's government was defeated in the Canadian House of Commons by a motion of non-confidence in mid-December 1979. The Liberal Party persuaded Trudeau to stay on as leader and fight the election. Trudeau defeated Clark in the February 1980 election and won a majority government. Section 8. Return to power. The Liberal victory in 1980 highlighted a sharp geographical divide in the country. The party had won no seats west of Manitoba. Trudeau had to resort to having senators appointed to cabinet to ensure representation from all regions. The introduction of the National Energy Program created a firestorm of protest in the western provinces and increased what many termed quote-unquote Western alienation. A series of difficult budgets by longtime loyalist Alan McEachern in the early 1980s did not improve Trudeau's economic reputation. However, after tough bargaining on both sides, Trudeau did reach a revenue-sharing agreement on energy with Alberta Premier Peter Lougheed in 1982. Section 8.1. Quebec Referendum. Two very significant events for Canada occurred during Pierre Trudeau's final term in office. The first was the defeat of the referendum on Quebec's sovereignty, called by the Parti Québécois government of René Lévesque. In the debates between Trudeau and Lévesque, Canadians were treated to a contest between two highly intelligent, articulate, and bilingual politicians who, despite being bitterly opposed, were each committed to the democratic process. Trudeau promised a new constitutional agreement with Quebec should it decide to stay in Canada, and the no side, that is, no to sovereignty, ended up receiving around 60% of the vote. Section 8.2. Patriation of the Constitution. Trudeau had attempted patriation of the Constitution earlier in his career, but always ran into a combined force of provincial premiers on the issue of an amending formula. After he threatened to go to London alone, a Supreme Court decision led Trudeau to meet with the premiers one more time. Trudeau reached an agreement with 9 of the premiers, with the notable exception of Lévesque. Quebec's refusal to agree to the new constitution became a source of continued acrimony between the federal and Quebec governments. Even so, the patriation was achieved. The Constitution Act 1982 was proclaimed by Queen Elizabeth on April 17, 1982. Following this, Trudeau commented in his memoirs, quote, "I always said it was thanks to 3 women that we were eventually able to reform our Constitution. The Queen, who was favourable, Margaret Thatcher, who undertook to do everything that our Parliament asked of her, and Jean Wads, who represented the interests of Canada so well in London. The Queen favoured my attempt to reform the Constitution. I was always impressed not only by the grace she displayed in public at all times, but by the wisdom she showed in private conversation." Unquote. Trudeau's approval rating slipped after the bounce from the 1982 patriation, and by the beginning of 1984, opinion polls showed the Liberals were headed for certain defeat if Trudeau remained in office. On February 29th, after a quote-unquote long walk in the snow, Trudeau decided to step down, ending his 15-year tenure as Prime Minister. He formally retired on June 30th. Image: the Proclamation of the Constitution Act, 1982. Section 9. Personal. Trudeau retired from politics on June 30th, 1984, and was succeeded by John Turner. Shortly after, he joined the Montreal law firm Heenan Blakey as counsel. Though he rarely gave speeches or spoke to the press, his interventions into public debate had a significant impact when they occurred. Trudeau wrote and spoke out against both the Meech Lake Accord and Charlottetown Accord proposals to amend the Canadian Constitution, arguing that they would weaken federalism and the Charter of Rights if implemented. His opposition was a critical factor leading to the defeat of the 2 proposals. He also spoke out against Jacques Parizeau and the Parti Québécois with less effect. In his final years, Trudeau commanded broad respect in Canada, but was regarded with suspicion in Quebec for his role in the 1982 constitutional deal, which was seen as having excluded that province, while dislike for him remained commonplace in Western Canada. Trudeau also remained active in international affairs, visiting foreign leaders and participating in international associations, such as the Club of Rome. He published his memoirs in 1993. The book sold hundreds of thousands of copies in several editions, and became one of the most successful Canadian books ever published. Trudeau lived in the historic Maison Cormier in Montreal, following his retirement from politics. In the last years of his life, he was afflicted with Parkinson's disease and prostate cancer, and became less active, although he continued to work at his law office until a few months before his death at the age of 80. He was devastated by the death of his youngest son, Michel Trudeau, who was killed in an avalanche in November 1998. Section 10. Marriage and Children. Later in life, 1971, while Prime Minister, he quietly married Margaret Sinclair, a young playgirl 30 years his junior. They were incompatible, for her image of Trudeau as romantic playboy was based entirely on false media hype. He was actually a workaholic and an intense intellectual with little time for family or fun. After 3 children were born, they separated in 1977 and were finally divorced in 1980. Their 3 children were Justin, born December 25, 1971, Alexandra Sasha, born December 25, 1973, and Michel, October 2, 1975 to 13th November 1998. When his divorce was finalized in 1984, Trudeau became the first Prime Minister to become a single parent as the result of divorce. In 1991, Trudeau became a father again with Deborah Coyne. This was his first and only daughter, named Sarah. Trudeau did not marry Coyne. Section 10.1. Death. Pierre Elliott Trudeau died on September 28, 2000, and was buried in the Trudeau family crypt, Saint-Rémy de Napierville Cemetery, Saint-Rémy, Quebec. He lay in state to allow Canadians to pay their last respects. The response by Canadians was unprecedented in its size and public outpouring of emotion. He is survived by his ex-wife Margaret, his sons Justin Trudeau and Alexandra Sasha Trudeau, and his daughter Sarah, whom he fathered by Deborah Coyne. During the state funeral, Justin delivered an emotional yet articulate eulogy that led to widespread speculation in the media that a career in politics was in his future. Justin was elected to the House of Commons in late 2008. Many world politicians paid their respects to Trudeau by attending the funeral. Image: Mourners at Trudeau's coffin. Section 11. Spirituality. Trudeau was a Roman Catholic and attended church throughout his life. While mostly private about his beliefs, he made it clear that he was a believer, stating in an interview with the United Church Observer in 1971, quote, "I believe in life after death, I believe in God, and I'm a Christian," unquote. Trudeau maintained, however, that he preferred to impose constraints on himself rather than have them imposed from the outside. In this sense, he believed he was more like a Protestant than a Catholic of the era in which he was schooled. Michael W. Higgins, president of St. Thomas University, has researched Trudeau's spirituality and finds that it incorporated elements of 3 Catholic traditions. The first of these was the Jesuits, who provided his education up to the college level. Trudeau frequently displayed the logic and love of argument consistent with that tradition. A second great spiritual influence in Trudeau's life was Dominican. According to Michel-Georges Rector of the Collège Dominicain Philosophie et Théologie, Trudeau, quote, considered himself a lay Dominican, unquote. He studied philosophy under Dominican father Louis-Marie Régis and remained close to him throughout his life, regarding Régis as quote-unquote spiritual director and friend. Another skein in Trudeau's spirituality was a contemplative aspect acquired from his association with the Benedictine tradition. According to Higgins, Trudeau was convinced of the centrality of meditation in a life fully lived. He took retreats at Saint-Benoît-du-Lac, Quebec, and regularly attended hours and the Eucharist at Montreal's Benedictine community. Although never publicly theological in the way of Margaret Thatcher or Tony Blair, nor evangelical in the way of Jimmy Carter or George W. Bush, Trudeau's spirituality, according to Higgins, quote, suffused, anchored, and directed his inner life. In no small part, it defined him, unquote. Section 12. Legacy. Trudeau remains well regarded by many Canadians. However, the passage of time has only slightly softened the strong antipathy he inspired among his opponents. Trudeau's charisma and confidence as Prime Minister and his championing of the Canadian identity are often cited as reasons for his popularity. His strong personality, contempt for his opponents, and distaste for compromise on many issues have made him, as historian Michael Bliss puts it, quote, one of the most admired and most disliked of all Canadian prime ministers, unquote. Quote, he haunts us still, unquote, biographers Christina McCall and Stephen Clarkson wrote in 1990. Trudeau's electoral successes were matched in the 20th century only by those of Mackenzie King. In all, Trudeau is undoubtedly one of the most dominant and transformative figures in Canadian political history. Trudeau's most enduring legacy may lie in his contribution to Canadian nationalism and of pride in Canada in and for itself, rather than as a derivative of the British Commonwealth. His role in this effort, and his related battles with Quebec on behalf of Canadian unity, cemented his political position when in office despite the controversies he faced, and remain the most remembered aspect of his tenure afterward. Some consider Trudeau's economic policies to have been a weak point. Inflation and unemployment marred much of his prime ministership. When Trudeau took office in 1968, Canada had a debt of $18 billion, 24% of GDP, which was largely left over from World War II. When he left office in 1984, that debt stood at $200 billion, 46% of GDP, an increase of 83% in real terms. However, these trends were present in most Western countries at the time, including the United States. Though his popularity had fallen in English Canada at the time of his retirement in 1984, public opinion later became more sympathetic to him, particularly in comparison to his successor, Brian Mulroney. Pierre Trudeau is today seen in very high regard on the Canadian political scene. Many politicians still use the term, quote-unquote, taking a walk in the snow, a throwaway line Trudeau used to describe his decision to leave office in 1984. Other popular Trudeauisms frequently used are, quote-unquote, just watch me, the quote-unquote Trudeau salute, and quote-unquote fuddle-duddle. Section 12.1. Constitutional Legacy. One of Trudeau's most enduring legacies is the 1982 patriation of the Canadian Constitution, including a domestic amending formula and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It is seen as advancing civil rights and liberties, and, notwithstanding clause aside, has become a cornerstone of Canadian values for most Canadians. It also represented the final step in Trudeau's liberal vision of a fully independent and nationalist Canada based on fundamental human rights and the protection of individual freedoms, as well as those of linguistic and cultural minorities. Court challenges based on the Charter of Rights have been used to advance the cause of women's equality, re-establish French school boards in provinces such as Alberta and Saskatchewan, and to mandate the adoption of same-sex marriage all across Canada. Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982 has clarified issues of Aboriginal and equality rights, including establishing the previously denied Aboriginal rights of Métis. Section 15, dealing with equality rights, has been used to remedy societal discrimination against minority groups. The coupling of the direct and indirect influences of the Charter has meant that it has grown to influence every aspect of Canadian life, and the override, notwithstanding clause of the Charter has been infrequently used. Canadian Conservatives claim the Constitution has resulted in too much judicial activism on the part of the courts in Canada. It is also heavily criticized by Quebec nationalists, who resent that the Constitution was never ratified by any Quebec government and does not recognize a constitutional veto for Quebec. Section 12.2. Bilingualism. Bilingualism is one of Trudeau's most lasting accomplishments, having been fully integrated into the federal government's services, documents, and broadcasting, not, however, in provincial governments, except for Ontario and New Brunswick. While official bilingualism has settled some of the grievances Francophones had towards the federal government, Many francophones had hoped that Canadians would be able to function in the official language of their choice no matter where in the country they were. However, Trudeau's ambitions in this arena have been overstated. Trudeau once said that he regretted the use of the term quote-unquote bilingualism because it appeared to demand that all Canadians speak two languages. In fact, Trudeau's vision was to see Canada as a bilingual confederation in which all cultures would have a place. In this way, his conception broadened beyond simply the relationship of Quebec to Canada. Section 12.3. Cultural Legacy. Few outside the museum community recall the tremendous efforts Trudeau made in the last years of his tenure to see to it that the National Gallery of Canada and the Canadian Museum of Civilization finally had proper homes in the national capital. The Trudeau government also implemented programs which mandated Canadian content in film and broadcasting and gave substantial subsidies to develop the Canadian media and cultural industries. Though the policies remain controversial, Canadian media industries have become stronger since Trudeau's arrival. Furthermore, his cultural legacy can be found in Canada's strong ties to multiculturalism. Section 12.4. Legacy with respect to Western Canada. Trudeau's posthumous reputation in the Western provinces is notably less favorable than it is in the rest of English-speaking Canada. He is often regarded as the, quote, father of Western alienation, unquote. The reasons for this are various. Some of them are ideological. Some Canadians disapproved of official bilingualism and many other of Trudeau's policies, which they saw as moving the country away from its historic traditions and attachments and markedly toward the political left. Such feelings were perhaps strongest in the West. Other reasons for Western alienation are more plainly regional in nature. To many Westerners, Trudeau's policies seem to favor other parts of the country, especially Ontario and Quebec, at their expense. Outstanding among such policies was the National Energy Program, which was seen as unfairly depriving Western provinces of the full economic benefit from their oil and gas resources in order to pay for nationwide social programs and make regional transfer payments to poorer parts of the country. Sentiments of this kind were especially strong in oil-rich Alberta, where unemployment rose from 4 to 10% following passage of the NEP. Estimates have placed Alberta's losses between $50 billion and $100 billion because of the NEP. More particularly, two incidents involving Trudeau are remembered as having fostered Western alienation and as emblematic of it. During a visit to Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, on July 17, 1969, Trudeau met with a group of farmers who were protesting that the federal government was not doing more to market their wheat. The widely remembered perception is that Trudeau dismissed the protesters' concerns with, quote-unquote, "Why should I sell your wheat?" In reality, however, the media never adequately reported the fact that he asked the question rhetorically and then proceeded to answer it himself. Years later, on a train trip through Salmon Arm, British Columbia, he quote-unquote gave the finger to a group of protesters through the carriage window. Less widely remembered is that the protesters were shouting anti-French slogans at the train. Section 12.5. Legacy with respect to Quebec. Trudeau's legacy in Quebec is mixed. Many credit his actions during the October crisis as crucial in terminating the Front de Libération du Québec as a force in Quebec, and ensuring that the campaign for Quebec separatism took a democratic and peaceful route. However, his imposition of the War Measures Act, which received majority support at the time, is remembered by some in Quebec and elsewhere as an attack on democracy. Trudeau is also credited by many for the defeat of the 1980 Quebec referendum. At the federal level, Trudeau faced almost no strong political opposition in Quebec during his time as Prime Minister. For instance, his Liberal Party captured 74 out of 75 Quebec seats in the 1980 federal election. Provincially, though, Quebecers twice elected the pro-sovereignty Parti Québécois. Moreover, there were not then any pro-sovereignty federal parties such as the Bloc Québécois. Since the signing of the Constitutional Act of Canada in 1982, the Liberal Party of Canada has never succeeded in winning a majority of seats in Quebec. Trudeau was disliked by many Québécois, particularly in the news media, the academic and political establishments. While his reputation has grown in English Canada since his retirement in 1984, it has not improved in Quebec. Section 12.6. Intellectual Contributions. Trudeau made a number of contributions throughout his career to the intellectual discourse of Canadian politics. Trudeau was a strong advocate for a federalist model of government in Canada, developing and promoting his ideas in response and contrast to strengthening Quebec nationalist movements, for instance, the social and political atmosphere created during Maurice Duplessis' time in power. Federalism in this context can be defined as, quote, a particular way of sharing political power among different peoples within a state. Those who believe in federalism hold that different peoples do not need states of their own in order to enjoy self-determination. Peoples may agree to share a single state while retaining substantial degrees of self-government over matters essential to their identity as peoples, unquote. As a social democrat, Trudeau sought to combine and harmonize his theories on social democracy with those of federalism so that both could find effective expression in Canada. He noted the ostensible conflict between socialism, with its usually strong centralist government model, and federalism, which expounded a division and cooperation of power by both federal and provincial levels of government. In particular, Trudeau states that socialists, rather than water down their socialism, must constantly seek ways of adapting it to a bicultural society governed under a federal constitution. And since the future of Canadian federalism lies clearly in the direction of cooperation, the wise socialist will turn his thoughts in that direction, keeping in mind the importance of establishing buffer zones of joint sovereignty and cooperative zones of joint administration between the two levels of government. Trudeau pointed out that in sociological terms, Canada is inherently a federalist society, forming unique regional identities and priorities, and therefore a federalist model of spending and jurisdictional powers is most appropriate. He argues, quote, in the age of the mass society, it is no small advantage to foster the creation of quasi-sovereign communities at the provincial level, where power is that much less remote from the people, unquote. Unfortunately, Trudeau's idealistic plans for a cooperative Canadian federalist state were resisted and hindered as a result of his narrowness on ideas of identity and socio-cultural pluralism. Quote, while the idea of a quote-unquote nation in the sociological sense is acknowledged by Trudeau, he considers the allegiance which it generates, emotive and particularistic, to be contrary to the idea of cohesion between humans, and as such, creating fertile ground for the internal fragmentation of states and a permanent state of conflict, unquote. This position garnered significant criticism for Trudeau, in particular from Quebec and First Nations peoples, on the basis that his theories denied their rights to nationhood. First Nations communities raised particular concerns with the proposed 1969 White Paper, developed under Trudeau by Jean Chrétien. Section 13. Supreme Court Appointments. Trudeau chose the following jurists to be appointed as justices of the Supreme Court of Canada by the Governor-General. Bora Laskin, March 19th, 1970 to March 17th, 1984, as Chief Justice, December 27th, 1973. Joseph Honoré Gérard Foteau, as Chief Justice, March 23rd, 1970 to December 23rd, 1973, appointed a Puisine Justice, December 22, 1949. Brian Dixon, March 26, 1973 to June 30, 1990, as Chief Justice, April 18, 1984. Jean Beats, January 1, 1974 to November 10, 1988. Louis-Philippe de Grandpré, January 1, 1974 to October 1, 1977. Willard Zebedee Este, September 29, 1977 to April 22, 1988. Yves Pratt, October 1, 1977 to June 30, 1979. William Rogers McIntyre, January 1, 1979 to February 15, 1989. Antonio Lamarche, March 28, 1980 to January 6, 2000. Bertha Wilson, March 4, 1982 to January 4, 1991. Gérard Ledin, May 29, 1984 to November 30, 1988. Section 14. Honors. The following honors were bestowed upon him by the Governor-General, or by Queen Elizabeth II herself. Trudeau was made a member of the Queen's Privy Council for Canada on April 4, 1967, giving him the style, the Honourable, and post-nominal PC for life. He was styled the Right Honourable for life on his appointment as Prime Minister on April 20, 1968. Trudeau was made a Companion of Honour in 1984. He was made a Companion of the Order of Canada, post-nominal CC, on June 24, 1985. He was granted arms, crest, and supporters by the Canadian Heraldic Authority on December 7, 1994. Other honours include the Canadian news agency, Canadian Press, named Trudeau Newsmaker of the Year a record 10 times, including every year from 1968 to 1975, and 2 more times in 1978 and 2000. In 1999, CP also named Trudeau, quote-unquote, Newsmaker of the 20th Century. Trudeau declined to give CP an interview on that occasion, but said in a letter that he was, quote-unquote, surprised and pleased. In many informal and unscientific polls conducted by Canadian internet sites, users also widely agreed with the honor. In 1983 to 1984, he was awarded the Albert Einstein Peace Prize for negotiating the reduction of nuclear weapons and Cold War tension in several countries. The Pierre Elliott Trudeau High School in Markham, Ontario is named in his honor. Collège Pierre Elliott Trudeau in Winnipeg, Manitoba is also named in his honor. The Montreal Pierre Elliott Trudeau International Airport, YUL, in Montreal, Quebec, was named in his honor effective January 1, 2004. In 2004, viewers of the CBC series The Greatest Canadian voted Trudeau the 3rd greatest Canadian. The government of British Columbia named a peak in the Cariboo Mountains Mount Pierre Elliott Trudeau on June 10, 2006. The peak is located in the Premier Range, which has many peaks named for British Columbian premiers and Canadian prime ministers. Trudeau was awarded a 2nd Dan Black Belt in Judo by the Takahashi School of Martial Arts in Ottawa. Trudeau was ranked 5th of the first 20 prime ministers of Canada, through Jean Chrétien in a survey of Canadian historians. The survey was used in the book Prime Ministers, Ranking Canada's Leaders, by J.L. Granatstein and Norman Hilmer. Section 14.1. Honorary Degrees. Duke University, in Durham, North Carolina, in 1974. Keio University, in Tokyo, Japan, in 1976, LLD. Queen's University, in Kingston, Ontario, in 1968. University of Alberta, in Edmonton, in 1968. University of Macau, in Macau, China, in 1987, LLD. University of Ottawa, in Ottawa, Ontario, in 1974. University of Notre-Dame-du-Lac, in Notre-Dame, Indiana, in 1982. Section 15. Trudeau in Film. Through hours of archival footage and interviews with Trudeau himself, the recent documentary Memoirs details the story of a man who used intelligence and charisma to bring together a country that was very nearly torn apart. Trudeau's life is depicted in 2 CBC television miniseries. The first one, Trudeau, with Colm Feore in the title role, depicts his years as Prime Minister. Trudeau 2, Maverick in the Making, with Stéphane Demers as the young Pierre and Toby Pelletier as him in later years, portrays his earlier life. The 1999 documentary film Just Watch Me, Trudeau and the 70s Generation, explores the impact of Trudeau's vision of Canadian bilingualism through interviews with 8 young Canadians. He was the co-subject, along with René Lévesque, in the Donald Britton-directed documentary miniseries The Champions. Section 16. Trudeau in music. Trudeau is name-checked in the song Wilted Rose by the Vanity Project, a side project band featuring former Bare Naked Lady singer Stephen Page. The lyric says, quote, "like Pierre Trudeau's walk out in the snow," unquote. An homage to Trudeau is, quote-unquote, Song for a Father by Jean Gomeshi of Moxie Fruvos fame, which chronicles the life of the politician. Section 17. Works by Trudeau. Please refer to the original article for links to several works by Trudeau. Section 18. See also. Please refer to the original article for links to several Wikipedia articles about specific topics related to Pierre Trudeau. These include articles on the death and state funeral of Pierre Trudeau, articles on history of the Quebec independence movement, articles on list of Canadian federal general elections, articles on politics of Canada, articles on Prime Minister nicknaming in Quebec, and articles on timeline of Canadian history. Section 19. Footnotes. Please refer to the original article for the footnotes. Section 20. Further reading. Please refer to the original article for a list of 32 books recommended for further reading. Section 20.1. Archival videos of Trudeau. Please refer to the original article for a list of 2 archival videos of Trudeau. Section 21. External links. Please refer to the original article for links related to Pierre Trudeau. We now come to the end of the spoken article, Pierre Trudeau. This sound file and all text in the article are licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution Share-alike 3.0 Unported License, available at http:// available at http available at creativcommons.org/licenses/by- available at creativcommons.org available at http://creativecommons.org/licenses/by-sa/3.0